Hey, good morning, everyone. We're at 9 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Molly, and I'm the Adult Programs Manager at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, and we are so glad you're here with us this morning. I'd like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I would also like to extend a thank you to our members and donors. Your support made this event possible. If you're not a member and are interested in learning more and want to consider joining, visit gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the conversation. For the duration of the lecture, the chat has been disabled. Please do note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the Georgia O'Keeffe website in a week or two. Captions in both English and Spanish will be available. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker without any further delay. We are so excited to be joined by Dale Kronkright, who is the head of conservation at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum and has been since its inception in 1997. Dale began research into the O'Keeffe studio materials and techniques in 2000 with scientists and conservators at the National Gallery of Art, resulting in the 2006 exhibition and catalog Color and Conservation, which documented the 40-year friendship of conservator Carolyn Keck and the Georgia O'Keeffe. There is plenty more to read about Dale's background and experience, which you can do on our website. But rather than delay any further, I'm so pleased and happy to welcome Dale, who's going to give us a wonderful journey today into a very special painting.
Thanks so much, Molly. Great to be here. Welcome everyone who's joining us, broadcasting live from Gallery 5 here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. And we're going to be talking about this incredible painting that hangs here behind me, Crossed with Red Heart, an oil on canvas by George O'Keeffe from 1932. Hardly a person that I have seen walk through our gallery number 4, which is paintings by George O'Keeffe from the Lake George area. Walks into Gallery 5, sees this 7-foot tall painting of this sturdy, brightly colored, beautiful cross form with gorgeous multicolored diagonal clouds at the top, the Gaelic rooster on the top of the cross, and this blood red sacred heart surrounded by brightly white and gray circles, and isn't stopped dead in their tracks. That is this an O'Keeffe? Who's this by? It doesn't look like a typical O'Keeffe in the sense that it's not a leaf form or a flower form or a bone form or even a southwestern landscape. It's completely different. And yet we have to remember that everything that O'Keeffe paints her entire life is entirely intentional, that there's an intention behind making it 7 foot. There's an intention behind centering the blood red sacred heart. There's an intention in the clouds. There's an intention with its verticality, its uprightness, its almost figurative demeanor as it stands in front of you. And then as you start to look at some of the painting techniques that have been used in the sky, in the foreground, you begin to see the characteristics of George O'Keeffe's handling of oil paints. And like all George O'Keeffe paintings, you see it from across the room and you think you know what it is. And somehow it invites you in and it asks lots of questions of you, and you begin this internal dialogue with this painting. And like all O'Keeffe paintings, yeah, they speak to you, or at least they speak to me, and I hope they speak to you. I encourage you to come and see this painting in person, because none of the slides I'm going to show you, while they're exciting and we get special views of the painting that you won't get in the gallery, none of them quite do the painting justice it'll do when you're here in person. I want to start off first by thanking the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum archivist, Hanny Yetlin. for her research assistance, pulling out the information that lies within the archive and within other research materials. And of course, the conservation volunteer extraordinaire, Barbara Kimball, for keeping our historic and our current conservation records in good order. I needed only to go to the file on this painting to see every conservation record that was held in the George O'Keeffe Foundation records before the museum was founded in '97. Of course, all of our conservation records as well. So, you know, my job as head of conservation here at the George O'Keeffe Museum is often to unravel what is a complex web of physical states and appearances that is presented by a work of art. And invariably, the appearance of every work is a complex interweaving of the materials and the techniques used by the artist during its creation and the history of how the work was used, where and how it traveled, the conditions it endured over the course of its lifetime. And so this work really is exactly that. It is this complex web. Cross with Red Heart is very large. It is the tallest painting that O'Keeffe had painted to that point. It's 7 feet tall. It is 40 inches wide. It is vividly colored. And it traveled a remarkable distance between when O'Keeffe painted it in 1932 and the extraordinary exhibition that you see behind me, made possible by Curtis Galleries of Minneapolis, Minnesota, who generously loaned it to the O'Keeffe Museum, both for a technical examination, for conservation, and of course for exhibition. And it's a special opportunity. So this view, the painting sideways in the conservation studio, and you're looking at the verso, the back of the painting, you're looking at the stretcher, which is the wooden structure that around which the canvas is stretched. And so I'm going to do a sort of a brief description for anybody here who might be visually challenged, who wants to know what we're talking about today. Cross with Red Heart is an oil painting on canvas, just slightly over 7 feet tall, 40 inches wide. It is stretched and tacked over a modified wood stretcher with an arched top, very unusual for a George O'Keeffe painting. It depicts a sturdy, tall, upright gray cross with spade-shaped finials at the ends of the cross, sides, and top. The bottom of the vertical upright member of the cross form is not visible. It penetrates the bottom edge of the painting through the foreground. There are intersecting gray and green wedge-shaped hills at the bottom of the foreground. The background is painted as an opaque blue sky, nearly white at the bottom of the foreground hill forms and becoming increasingly dark blue as the background rises above the cross arms. There are sweeping, diagonally oriented clouds that have been painted in the upper background, sweeping down from the viewer left edge down towards the viewer right. In a very dramatic fashion. There is a wind vane at the top of the cross form in the shape of a French-Canadian Gallic rooster symbolizing France. And at the center of the intersection of the vertical and the horizontal members of the cross is a blood red stylized sacred heart enclosed by a necklace-like chain of white circles and 16 almost spear point-like rays radiating out from that central form. So let's just take a look right now at some of the original materials and techniques applied by George O'Keeffe during the creation of this painting. At first, when you look across the room, you think the clouds are just going to be sort of white and light and dark grays, but there's so much color in these cloud forms. This is a slightly raking light photograph where we can see George O'Keeffe's use of stiff paint in order to give scrubbing brushwork-like texture to the paint. You'll notice there's a really black, dark cloud at the very top of the painting, just above the rooster, and then the irregular, organically formed clouds that give the whole canvas a sort of dynamic movement. There are gray clouds, of course, but there are also other colors included. So I want to point out you can see the laser that I'm applying right now to the screen, there's a beautiful umber coloration, a brown coloration here. There are streaks of cobalt and Prussian blue added to the clouds in numerous areas around the rooster form. And over here on the right, there's a little bit of yellow ochre that's been added to this umber cloud on the far right-hand side. So there's lots of modulation of warm colors as well as cool colors in these clouds that give them a very dynamic feel, almost as if the wind is blowing and you can feel the temperature of the air going around it. This is the canvas maker's stamp on the selvage edge, the very beginning of the canvas roll. And you can see that it's a Winsor & Newton product from London, and they've trade named it Chicken Canvas. This is Winsor & Newton's name for a twill weave canvas. And in a twill weave, the warp threads go the length of the roll, and the warp threads are kind of continuous. And then the weft threads, where the shuttle moves some of the warps up and some of the warps down, the weft threads go under and over 2 warp threads at a time, offset by 1. So it creates on the surface of the painting a diagonal pattern. This is really exciting for us because O'Keeffe started using this particular canvas in 1930. And it's characteristic of almost all of the New Mexico paintings, but of all the Canadian paintings as well. And we never had a selvage edge visible on any of her canvases, so we didn't know, there was no maker stamp, we didn't know who made it. We have excellent data on the priming materials because we've done analysis on all of those. So now that we have the maker stamp, we know that from 1930 through 1946, the point at which Stieglitz passes away and O'Keeffe prepares her life to move to New Mexico permanently, she uses this twill weave pattern made by Winsor & Newton. This is a close-up of some of the thinnest paints in the painting. And what we're going to be looking at here are the necklace-like chains that form the sun. And if you look carefully, for example, where the paint is thin in this bottom circle, you can see the twill weave effect. It's like a pair of blue jeans. It's almost the same exact weave. It's very, very sturdy. The crimp of the weft over the warp keeps it from stretching. It's very strong. It's really well suited for capturing paint. So look at this diagonal texture that you see in every one of these circles going from upper viewer left to lower viewer right. And that's the texture of a twill weave canvas. This is a 1935 page out of the Winsor & Newton catalog. And so it's artist prepared canvases, which means that they are already primed with a white primer. There are various kinds of primers you can order. But what's interesting is that the Ticken or twill canvas is the most expensive pre-prepared canvas that Winsor & Newton produces in the 1930s. And this painting is 1932, so it falls right in. And what's really fabulous about this particular page is this entry right here. Literally the widest loom that Winsor & Newton has, the widest canvas they make, is 86 inches wide. And that's exactly what this canvas is. With the tacking edges on the bottom of the top, that 86 inches makes it possible to do a 7-foot high painting. And so O'Keeffe bought the widest canvas that she could get. And over here, you can see that the Ticken or twill weave canvas per roll of 6 yards is 52 shillings or $6. And if you want to buy a segment of that per yard, it's 9 shillings British sterling, $6 a yard. So you might as well just buy the roll, right? But there's a reason why O'Keeffe purchased this large roll. It wasn't, I don't think, intentionally just for this painting, and we'll see that in just a second. This is a reflected infrared photograph of the top of the painting. So infrared light is just beyond the human visual spectrum. The human visual spectrum runs from sort of dark purple, which is at 400 nanometers wavelength, 400, up to 700 nanometers wavelength. So that's a dark red. So you can imagine all the colors of the rainbow when you see a rainbow in the sky. That's exactly the human visible spectrum. Beyond 700 nanometers is the infrared region. There's a near infrared region that runs about 850 nanometers to about a little over 1,000 nanometers. And that's the region that I like to photograph in, because once we get to 1,200 nanometers, the infrared light becomes heat, and it generates heat, and it actually warms the surface. So when I photograph from 850 to 1,100 nanometers, I'm not applying any heat to the surface, but I can see through most of the paints. So infrared is really informative about underdrawing. So for example, there's this diagonal cloud that you can see in the painting behind me. It's right there. And what we see, if you look very closely above my laser cursor, is the charcoal underdrawing of this very precise cloud shape. If we go over to the right above the horizontal cross member, we can begin to see the same thing here. And a lot depends on the resolution of your screen and how well we're broadcasting over the internet. But trust me that there's charcoal underdrawing, some of it heavy, some of it light, under all these cloud shapes. It becomes much harder to see in the cross, although we do. So you can see the cross has a white stripe down one side, sort of giving it a sense of three-dimensional depth. And we see the underdrawing right down that white stripe. The reason we don't see it in the cross proper or in the radiant parts of the Sacred Heart is because one of the main absorbers of infrared light is charcoal, is carbon, and everywhere that the paint is heavily pigmented with a charcoal black, in this case, this is bone black that O'Keeffe is using, we can't see the underdrawing. So that's why we're not seeing it there. What we do see is the different absorbances of different pigments in the infrared region. So for example, you can see in this cloud form up at the upper right, there's kind of a light gray and then a slightly darker gray and then a dark gray. That's O'Keeffe changing the pigment mixture each time she's painting more and more of the cloud. The same is true with the Sacred Heart in the very middle. If you look carefully, you can see that there's one paint that reflects the infrared very, very strongly. And it looks like, because it's reflecting, a very bright white at the center of that red heart, indicating the use of one pigment mixture. And then the outer becomes a little bit darker. And if we look carefully, we can see O'Keeffe adding a little bit of that bone black to give it a darker red, indicating a sort of volumetric shading, right? So infrared's really informative because it shows us how O'Keeffe is painting and when she's changing her paint mixtures. This is another imaging method. This is ultraviolet induced visible luminescence. So in ultraviolet induced visible luminescence, we're going on the other end of the rainbow spectrum. Instead of using long wavelengths, we're using very short wavelengths, shorter than visible purple. So here we're looking at 350 nanometers. Visible purple, if you remember, is 400 nanometers. So again, sort of invisible to the human eye. And you might ask, well, so why are we seeing color? Well, 350 nanometer ultraviolet excites linseed oil and the other drying oils like poppy seed oil and walnut seed oil. And in that excitation of those outer valence electrons, they give off that absorbed energy by glowing a yellowish greenish color. That yellowish greenish color in the linseed oil then scatters off the pigment particles that O'Keeffe put into the paint and then fluoresces or luminesces the colors that we see here. And again, the reason why this imaging technique is so important is that it shows us O'Keeffe, every time O'Keeffe changes her pigment mixture, slightly altering the color that she's painting, and we can see it in higher contrast than we could normally see it in visible light. So you can see, for example, O'Keeffe moving from a dark cerulean blue up here and in stages, adding small amounts of white to take what looks like in the cross behind me, what looks like almost a white foreground, but in actuality, they are sort of stepped phases from blue to white. And that's the beauty of ultraviolet. We can see when she's adding a little bit more linseed or walnut or poppy seed oil to the paint to extend it. That's these areas that are fluorescing sort of yellow across the area of the painting. And the dark, what is normally green in the foreground, in the painting behind me, is viridian chrome green. And you'll notice it's almost black. And that's because there are some pigments that glow in ultraviolet and some pigments that absorb the ultraviolet and don't glow. And that helps us identify the pigments. So infrared imaging helps us identify the pigments. It gives us an initial idea of what pigments O'Keeffe is using. Ultraviolet either confirms or challenges us on those assumptions. And then we use another technique, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, to look at the chemistry and confirm. So we have three things that help us identify and characterize the paints that O'Keeffe is using. This is, again, ultraviolet induced visible luminescence. We're making the paint glow from within and then photographing the colors that are glowing. If you're in the room taking this photograph, the room is absolutely dark. And so again, we can see O'Keeffe changing her mixtures as we work up. But what's really interesting is that there's almost this hard horizontal border where O'Keeffe goes from mixing in white and everything above that is a solid blue paint. That solid blue paint is called cerulean blue. It's a mixture of a chemical cobalt tin. It's a cobalt tin complex. And that cobalt tin complex gives a very opaque blue paint. So whereas Prussian blue is translucent, we can see through it almost like stained glass. Cobalt blue would be the same way, a very translucent paint. Cobalt tin blue or cerulean blue is opaque. And it's opaque because partially because the pigment particles themselves are extremely large. They're larger than the very small pigment particles that we would see, say, in the gray and the black of the cross or in the red of the Sacred Heart. And that's what gives it its opacity. So fine pigment particles in oil paint are very translucent. So you can look at the ochres and the umbers and some of the reds, and they're very translucent. When the pigment particles are ground deliberately by the paint manufacturer to be large, we have a very opaque paint. And so we have lead white, for example, lead carbonate is another great opaque paint, and cerulean blue is another one. And that is very important because it explains much of the condition of this painting over time, as we'll discuss shortly. So the third way I said that we characterize the paints is with X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. And this is a handheld X-ray fluorescence unit. It looks like a ray gun, if you will, sort of from the future. But when I was in graduate school, probably dating myself a little bit here, this is a much larger instrument. It took up most of a small room that had to be lead lined because the X-rays, and you had to stand outside of it. These days, because of microprocessors, we can control the amount of X-rays coming out of this. So this is essentially a camera. It's its own illumination source, and it's its own camera to pick up what gets reflected back by the object. When you pull the trigger, a small amount of very specific X-rays come out a short distance, focused on a very small area, about half a centimeter. Those X-rays excite the inner valence electrons of every single atom that is in that paint mixture. So if there's a pigment in there, I'm almost certain to see it in extreme clarity. And then when those inner valence electrons jump back in, because the X-rays are going on and off at about 60 times a second, they give off a little bit of light, a little bit of X-rays, and each X-ray wavelength is specific to every atom on the periodic chart. So it's remarkably accurate in identifying materials. So this is what you get back. Instead of a photograph, what you do is you get a series of peaks throughout the X-ray region, and each peak is specific to an atom. So this is actually the primer with no paint on it. This is the primer that Winsor Newton applies in 2 layers. Because we can see under the microscope, we can see there are 2 layers of priming in this, which is very specific. Most of the European canvas makers are doing this. The first peak over here on the far left, way up there, is calcium. And that particular peak is the underlayer. It's a mixture of a filling pigment, an inexpensive filling pigment, calcium carbonate, and calcium sulfate. And we suspect that's calcium sulfate because this little shoulder over here is where the sulfur peak is. We can see that there's a little bit of zinc here, a small peak. This is the zinc K-electron shell alpha peak. They're all labeled. And then over here on the far right, another really big peak, and that's lead. So what we've learned is that there's lead and zinc in the primer, but what's really interesting is this complex right over here. You can see in this complex, we have barium in the form of barium sulfate. So that's why we have our sulfur peak. We have a small amount of titanium, and then we have zinc. In the 1920s, a pigment mixture of white pigments was developed called lithopone. And that's exactly what this is. The second layer of the priming material is, the first layer of priming material is calcium carbonate and lithopone. And the second layer on top of that, prepared by Winsor Newton, is beautiful opaque lead carbonate. That's just kind of how we confirm what we see in ultraviolet. This is the same spectra, only with the bright red of the heart. So what you can see is that our original brown line where our white primer was identified, those are all still there. But notice that the blue line, which is what we're interested in right now, is the red of the heart. The blue line is much smaller in this region, and that's because it's covering over the primer. The primer's covered up, and so the signal is really drowned out by the blue chemicals. And the blue chemicals is a complex of cadmium right here. So there's some strong cadmium. There's selenium right here. So the bright blue lines of selenium. So we have cadmium, both cadmium sulfide. Notice that our sulfur shoulder here is way the heck up. So we have cadmium sulfide, we have cadmium selenide, and we have lead red. Our lead peaks here and over here are much higher. So we have lead oxide. So the red is a mixture of two pigments, and they both behave differently in oil. They're both very, very flexible, and that helps us inform how those paints are going to age and deteriorate over time. So condition-wise, the painting is extraordinarily clean given its age. It's 92 years old. The canvas remains relatively strong and flexible. It is sagging slightly in the foreground hill areas, but there are some very specific paintings that tell us something about the life of this painting and what it's gone through. So if we begin to look, we can see our cloud forms again and the beautiful coloration of those cloud forms in this raking light shot. So in this photograph, the light is nearly parallel with the horizontal surface, and we do that so that we can create deep shadows and see something of the texture. And what's most prominent here in this cerulean blue, and remember the cerulean blue pigments are very large pigment particles taking up a lot of space. They're very opaque, and they make a very brittle paint, very stiff and brittle paint once the paints are fully cured. And we see a whole series of cracks in this photograph moving diagonally in this direction. On both sides of the cross, we have these diagonal cracks in a deep complex. And notice the cracks go right up to the cloud and then they stop. And the same is true with the lower clouds. The cracks come right down to the cracks of the clouds and then they stop. Same thing over here on the right. What's interesting is that they move diagonally from upper right to lower left at right angles to the twill weave canvas, which has its stiffening weft threads moving at a right angle to that. So that tells me some very specific things, and that is that these cracks are relatively closed, but they're vaulted. They've been pushed up. And when they're pushed up like this and not pulled apart, so if they were pulled apart, that would be a tension crack. That would mean that the canvas has been pulled, been stretched, the stretcher has moved, and it's pulled the paint apart. But what these sort of vaulted or tented paint forms are telling me is that they're closed and they've been pushed up. And that means that the paint itself has somehow swollen. The paint it had to at some point take up more space than it originally took when O'Keeffe painted it. And because it had nowhere to go, it had to vault. It had to literally crack and move up. And it did it in the weakest direction, that is at right angles to the weft threads. So that means it's doing it at the flexible warp threads. That suggests that this painting has seen probably two conditions that advanced its deterioration in this way. Despite being still strong in the canvas and despite the paint still being well adhered and being clean, it suggests that at some point this painting saw some very high temperatures, possibly with some high humidity as well. And those high temperatures would be, we'd say, 85, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So we have to think about when this painting might have seen that kind of temperature along with high humidity. If we look at the lower register of the painting, we can see that there are some sags in the painting. The painting is billowing slightly horizontally. We see one billow here, another high ridge here, another high ridge right at the gray, and then a diagonal billow right towards the bottom, which tells me a great deal. And that is that the painting, and likewise in the center. So if you look at the cross itself, you can see that there are small undulations, ripples in the gray-black paint of the cross. So here's a high point, and then a shadow, a low point, and then a high point and a shadow, high point, shadow. So there's this irregular warping. So what that tells me is that the flexible gray paints were able to accommodate this movement of the blue paints of the backgrounds, and they've essentially taken up the slack by distorting, but that the blue paints are very, very brittle, and they can't respond in the same way. They can't allow the canvas to move, they can't allow the canvas to sag, and so they heave up, again suggesting that the brittle paints have been affected, as this whole painting might have been, by very high temperatures sometime in its past. So we're just taking another general look of all those cracks. And remember that the cracks, if you come here in the gallery and see the painting behind me, you're not going to see those cracks by and large, because this is an extremely radically lit view for the camera so that we can capture the location of all those cracks. Okay, now we're using the infrared light the same way we did almost when we were trying to see the underdrawing in the painting, right? So we can still see at the edges of the cloud, if you look carefully where my laser is now, you can see those same beautiful underdrawn areas where the charcoal is. But what I'm trying to do now is I'm taking the infrared illumination source and I'm shining it through the canvas itself, and I'm coming right through the paint. And notice, if you look carefully, that there are a series of white lines in this photograph. There's no color because it's in the infrared. It's not something that humans can see color, but we can see light to dark. And if you look carefully, I'm outlining a whole series of these white lines, and then there are some bright white little specks. So there's a speck there, there's a bright white speck here, and those are white because the infrared light is coming through in much higher quantity. And those are the cracks. So one of the ways that I determine which cracks are open and which cracks are active, that is that they're not adhered to the canvas at that crack site and they need to be repaired, is this transmitted infrared technique, where we can begin to see which cracks. So this crack, for example, this group, some of this crack is closed and the infrared light doesn't come through as well, and some parts are open. So that's a partial crack. There are other cracks in the area here where the paints are thin, where they're not open at all, and they're really well adhered. So transmitted infrared light is one of the ways that I determine where there's active deterioration going on and where there's just old passive deterioration that's not going to get any worse. Now we're looking at the back of the canvas. We're looking at the unpainted surface. I've stabilized all the paints on the surface of the painting. They're secured. And we've taken the stretcher off because the stretcher needed some repairs. The stretcher was broken at the top of that arch. And the most interesting thing you see right off the bat is that there are folds of painted canvas at the top corners, right? So that indicates that the painting was in fact a rectangle originally, and that it was made to be an arch by folding the corners over this stretcher. So this can't be the original stretcher. This has got to be a secondary stretcher. The second thing you notice is that all those vaulted cracks that we saw on the surface are visible in the canvas texture. So here's that brittle cerulean blue. Here's the cross member right here. If you look carefully, you can see the heart form. You can see the ripples of the vertical form of the cross. Here's our rooster up here at the top. These are the clouds. Here's our diagonal foreground buckles in the canvas where the canvas became loose. But this again reinforces two things. One, that we are looking at expanded paints as a result of heat, possibly early shrinking of the canvas due to high humidity, but that they are old cracks. If these cracks were recent, if they were new, we wouldn't, the cracks, the vaulting of the cracks wouldn't have the time to pull the canvas up along with the paint. But all the cracks that we have seen in this dark cerulean blue, brittle, big pigmented paint are visible on the verso. And that tells us that these cracks happened a long time ago and that they've been there for a very, very long time. And also that we originally had a rectangular painting at the beginning. So let's see how I'm doing on time. Molly, you can jump in anytime. Looks like we're still doing okay. So in 1929, probably all of you know that George O'Keeffe and Rebecca Strand came to New Mexico for O'Keeffe's first kind of creative adventure into New Mexico. It's kind of the visit that started it all. But what's interesting is that while they came in 1929, 1930, and 1931, the year that our painting, Cross with Red Heart, was done, they did not come to New Mexico. O'Keeffe did not visit New Mexico in 1932, nor did she visit in 1933. And that's because 1932 was a year of disruption and turmoil in O'Keeffe's personal and professional life. Part of that turmoil was a result of the relationship between O'Keeffe's husband, gallerist Alfred Stieglitz, and his gallery assistant, Dorothy Norman. In 1932, the year that O'Keeffe painted this painting, O'Keeffe's husband, Stieglitz, mounted an exhibition of photographic portraits using Dorothy Norman as his model. And this exhibit of Norman portraits immediately followed the exhibition of O'Keeffe's paintings of New Mexico landscapes that she had painted in 1930, the bones, the adobe buildings that we're all familiar with. Some of the photographs of Norman, as you can see here, suggests the seriousness of the relationship with Stieglitz. And at this point, the seriousness, the intimacy of that relationship becomes public knowledge. So you can imagine emotionally how that might have affected this early February 1932 exhibition of Norman photographs becomes public. The second thing that happened was this painting, also 1932. And this is probably the reason that O'Keeffe purchased that widest roll of Winsor Newton Ticken canvas. 1930, shortly after the financial crash of the Depression in 1929, John D. Rockefeller decides that he can use his enormous wealth and sort of lift the spirits as well as employ the unemployed workers in New York by building a new city center. And he wants to build a very tall complex of buildings that makes it possible to do radio broadcasting, that allows the development of different technologies such as television. He wants it to be a music hall. He wants to be an entertainment center. And that becomes Radio City Music Hall. And during the final stages of Radio City Music Hall in 1932, John D. Rockefeller offers artists to work with his interior designer to come up with modern art depictions of New York for the interior spaces of Radio City Music Hall. O'Keeffe very much wants to enter that competition. She feels like she has an idea for a beautiful, large 7-foot painting, almost cubist, as you can see here, of representation of Radio City Music Hall and the enormous canyons created by the tall buildings going up in New York, with a sort of wonderful flourish of floating flowers, as O'Keeffe has done in New Mexico. Stieglitz is very much against her accepting this commission. And the reason why is that Rockefeller states that every artist will get a no more than $1,500 payment for the murals to be painted inside the Radio City Music Hall. And he feels that this will probably undermine the value of other O'Keeffe works. And so he doesn't want her to accept it. She very much wants to do it. She submits a drawing of this painting and then later the painting itself to the committee, and she wins this commission. For reasons related to the construction of the and preparation of the wall for the mural is never realized. This painting exists. It's in the Smithsonian American Art Collection, but this again creates this more turmoil. So amidst this turmoil in 1932, O'Keeffe's artistic colleague and friend, Paul Strand, the photographer, exhibits a series of paintings that he had made on the far Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec. He went there in 1929, taking advantage of a road that had a paved road that had just been completed, making it possible to encircle the entire edge of the Gaspé Peninsula. And Strand took some 60 images using his 4x5 camera, taking beautifully geometric compositions of sheds and barns and seascapes, many of which O'Keeffe would have seen when Stieglitz exhibits all those photographs guess when, in April of 1932, right after the Dorothy Norman exhibition. So O'Keeffe seems to have decided, amidst all of this turmoil, after seeing Paul Strand's beautiful photographs of Quebec, that this would be a great place to go, take Stieglitz's young niece, Georgia Engelhard, she's about 26 years old, and the two of them can go up there and get away from Manhattan, get away from Lake George, perhaps get away from Stieglitz and all the turmoil, and sort of refresh their creative spirits. So this is a map of that area. The Gaspé Peninsula is this little tiny, up in the upper right-hand corner where my laser is pointing now, that's the Gaspé Peninsula. And it's not easy to get to the Gaspé Peninsula. You have to follow the road all the way down the St. Lawrence Seaway into the St. Lawrence River. Here's Quebec City. Way down here in the lower left corner is Montreal. And then just way below this, of course, is Lake George. So this is the adventure that George O'Keeffe and Georgia Engelhard take off in June of 1932. And they kind of underestimate how long it's going to take. So once you get beyond Quebec City, there are no hotels. And O'Keeffe finds that she has to stay with farmhouses and farming families who are willing to put them up overnight. And so the first trip, they never make it to the Gaspé Peninsula, forcing them to take a second trip in August of 1932. And with more supplies, knowing where they can stay and making better headway. During that long trip in Quebec, just outside of Montreal, O'Keeffe begins to see these wayside crosses. So this is actually very similar to the exact subject of our painting that you see in the back. It is a very tall, upright painting with carved finial ends to the cross, a Gaelic rooster wind vane at the top, a Sacred Heart in the middle, and of course, these sharp spear-like rays coming out. This is just outside of Montreal. This photograph was taken sometime in the teens, just outside of Montreal by a folk art scholar who's taking photographs of all the wayside crosses that he can find. And these are now in the Canadian Museum of History in Montreal. And they're really remarkable. These crosses are put up by farmers, they're put up by fishermen, seamen. They're very brightly colored. They're very erect and sturdy, and they put up with the winds and the weather of this St. Lawrence Seaway region in Quebec. And they're to bless the crops and to bless the fishermen going out, risking their lives at sea and so on. And they dot the whole landscape. And O'Keeffe obviously saw many of them and decided to paint one very similar to this. I'm quickly going to show you the other paintings that O'Keeffe did as a result of this Quebec trip. And the reason I'm doing it, as you can see in this painting, this is only 16 inches high and 30 inches wide. And it's a very different subject. It's part of the White Barns that Paul Strand was photographing during his trip in 1929. They certainly begin to suggest O'Keeffe's fascination with rectangular forms in her landscape painting. So we can see the rectangular black door that foreshadows O'Keeffe's paintings of her black patio door in the Abiquiu house, this trapezoidal roof, the cerulean blue skies. So these are likely the size that O'Keeffe could have taken in the car and painted as she stopped along the way. Our painting is much too large for her to have done that. And I'm just going to rapidly go through the 11 paintings that came out of that trip so you can get a sense of their scale and what she's painting. Pay attention to the green foregrounds and the clouds in each of these because they get repeated in our painting as well. But our painting was likely done when O'Keeffe comes back from the first trip, perhaps having seen a cross such as the one that we've painted and that we see in the painting, and that gap between June and August in the second trip. And then in this second trip, she's finally making her way towards the Gaspé Peninsula and seeing these beautiful white barns, see the scrubbing brush texture in the white and in the background blue skies with the clouds here, beginning to suggest what she's going to do with our painting. This one's much smaller. You can see it's only 9 by 12 inches. So the scale is portable. This is what can be taken in the car and painted without damaging. And of course, our 7-footer can't be done. This is the second cross that's done during that trip. We are not sure whether we are along the St. Lawrence Seaway, sort of looks like that, or we're actually perhaps on the Gaspé Peninsula. But again, this beautiful gray sort of yellow ochre cross with finials just dividing this sky space. Notice the arch shape of the foreground blue background that gets repeated in our large painting. This one was 36 by 24. There's a chance it could have been painted during the trip. More likely, this is a studio work as well. Beautiful landscape. And I want to bring this one to your attention because O'Keeffe is handling the reflection of the hillside in the water with these intersecting V shapes, these intersecting triangles, and these wedge shapes. And it's exactly the approach to a wedge-shaped foreground that she's using in the painting behind me. Same color palette as well. Beautiful wedge shapes making up the mountain itself. This is a beautiful small painting, 10 by 24, Nature Forms Gaspé, very dynamic, catching the cold ocean wind on the Gaspé Peninsula and how it swirls, how it feels, moving the clouds and moving across your face and moving across the beachhead in the Gaspé Peninsula. And you can see something of O'Keeffe's fascination with clouds, temperature, and sound. All of that is coming out. So this is our painting, along with one of the barn paintings here, and of course, the large painting, Jimson Weed, in the 1933 American Place exhibition staged by Alfred Stieglitz right after that 1932 adventure into Canada, into Quebec. And you can see the painting at this point in 1933 is rectangular. So the corners haven't been folded over. There's not an arched top. It's on its original stretcher. So the question is, at what point does it become rounded painting? And when did it get exposed to all that heat and moisture that caused the vaulting of the paint? So this is the Sacred Heart Church in Margaretville, New York, and it plays a very important role in this story. In February of 1962, O'Keeffe hires Fine Art Conservation Laboratories and her conservator at that point to receive Cross with Red Heart and to change the stretcher from a rectangular stretcher to a rounded one. She does this via her agent in New York, Doris Bree, who is holding the painting in storage. And the reason this happened was that a trustee of the Whitney Museum, a financier on Wall Street, Armin Erf, who was on the board of the Whitney and who also collected modern art, hoped to acquire and install this Sacred Heart painting for a church that he was building in memory of his mother in her hometown of Margaretville, the Sacred Heart Catholic Church. So Erf contacted Doris Bree. He had seen the painting. He wanted the painting to have an arch top because he had designed had designed by artists these very modern stained glass windows in the opening vestibule and doors, and then arched stained glass windows down the side of the church. And he wanted O'Keeffe's Cross with Red Heart to literally become the consecrated cross depicting the crucifix above the high altar of this church. He wanted it to be modern, and he wanted it to include modern art. So this is a copy of the letter to Fine Art Conservation Laboratories, February of 1962. And the secretary there is advising O'Keeffe that Cross with the Red Heart has arrived. It's in good conditions. I've ordered a new stretcher according to your instructions. We'll clean the surface. We'll mount it on the specially made turnbuckle type stretcher with 3 crossbars, and it'll be ready to go. So this is February of 1962. So now we know why the top of the painting was changed from our original configuration to the new configuration. And these, as you saw, are the folded corners around the new stretcher. And this is literally our painting, Cross with Red Heart, above the high altar of the church, Christmas, sometime around 1966, 1967. They've added a decorative painted frame around it, but it is in its arched shape and set into this. And this, in upstate New York, is likely very close to the ceiling where there's a lot of hot, damp air. This is where our painting is first exposed to these very extreme temperatures for a period of years. The painting stays there. So it's literally 30 years old at this point. Painted in 32, 62, it gets restretched onto a new stretcher. That's 30 years. And then it stays here from literally 1965 until the church decides they need to sell the painting. And they attempt to sell it in 1977. O'Keeffe has been contacted by the Indianapolis Museum of Art, who wants to acquire some O'Keeffe paintings. O'Keeffe asks it to be sent to Indianapolis Museum of Art to determine if it can be put back into its rectangular shape. Unfortunately, it can't be, and they write it to that effect. That's October 77. It goes back to the church, and it stays in the church until 1983, when they try again to sell the painting at a Sotheby's auction. 1984 at a Sotheby's auction. It doesn't sell, but a smart collector by the name of Myron Kunin is watching the sale, and he acquires it for his Curtis Galleries at that sale, and it has been with Curtis Galleries since 1984. So that's the story, Molly. I'll end it right there, and if we have a little time, we can take some questions and discuss it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dale. And in chats with you leading up to today's talk, shared how excited I was for this presentation. It's so wonderful to see how the physicality of these paintings help to document their stories, but also how this painting is situated in the life story of Georgia O'Keeffe. It's fascinating, and you covered so much territory. So first, I just want to thank you for that. We do have a few questions. First, we have someone who's interested in knowing how long this painting will be on view. Do you know how long people can come to visit this painting at the museum?
There's no specific end date. Curtis Galleries has generously allowed us to have it long term. We're preparing a new frame for it. Instead of the white frame that you see behind me, we're doing a frame that is the profile of the original silver gilt frame. That will provide some more protective qualities. It's going to have a special glazing on the front. It'll help slow the rates of deterioration. So we're going to be applying that shortly. And I suspect that this is a rather indefinite loan. It should be here for a good long time. And I would, I would schedule a trip. It is so unusual and so important to her life, as you said, Molly, that it'll be here a while. So, you don't have to cancel your existing plans, but do extend your plans to come to Santa Fe and see this painting.
So that's great news. So everyone here with us today, there's plenty of time. You should be able to see the work in person and appreciate it in that way as well. Another question we have, were the crosses in this series from this trip, do you know if any of them were painted on location, or do you think most of them were painted in a studio after the fact?
Great question. So there are only 2 crosses that O'Keeffe did during this trip. And obviously this largest one, 7-footer, couldn't be hauled around in the car, right? So we're reasonably certain this is a studio painting, either in Lake George or Manhattan, at either one of O'Keeffe's studios when she returns from the first trip. The second trip, we don't know. It certainly looks like it's much closer to the ocean, closer to the Gaspé Peninsula. I suspect it is after the second trip in 1932 in August. It is of a size that might just barely fit sort of in the back seat of the car. So there's a chance that it may be plein air, but I would suspect, looking at the size of all the barns and the nature forms Gaspé, which are much, much smaller, that this is likely the second cross is also a studio painting. But we have no letters right now that we've found in the archives that confirm or deny either one of those. So really, this is our best guess.
Great, it's so wonderful to imagine that process. Another question we have, it's a bit of a technical question. Did Georgia O'Keeffe place any varnish on the surface of this painting?
Great question. Great question. So the answer is no. She did not put any varnish on this painting. So the sort of values, the degree of saturation or wetness of these paintings, when you're here, you will see they are very, very matte and quite intentional. And that's very much O'Keeffe's direction starting in about 1928, 1926, that most of the paints become matte, they become desaturated. And certainly when they're in New Mexico, there's no saturation. So she strictly prohibited the varnishing of her paintings with natural resin varnishes that we probably all know as artists, Damar varnish and mastic varnish, because they do saturate and they make everything evenly glossy. She did work with her conservator, Caroline Keck, starting for the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1946, to protect the surface of her oil paintings with a very thin spray acrylic. And those days it was methyl methacrylate, and it was a water white, but it preserved the relationship between matte paintings and gloss paints. So maintaining the differences that O'Keeffe had put into the paint to be matte where she wanted matte paint, glossy where she wanted glossy paints. And it was a synthetic varnish in the sense that, like all varnishes, it could be taken off once it became dirty. And it protected the porous matte paints from coal soot that was very common in New York during this entire period. Unvarnished paintings would get just loaded with coal soot. Interestingly, starting in 1919, O'Keeffe insisted that every one of her paintings, because they were porous and matte, be protected by a glass glazing on the front of the frame so that they would not absorb coal soot. And that rule of having her paintings behind glass in every public exhibition, as well as in her home, even in New Mexico, she kept the glass on her paintings to help keep them clean. And that just goes hand in hand with her not wanting them varnished.
That's fascinating and makes a lot of sense when you see her pieces in person, that quality that's preserved for that reason. I think we have time for one more question. Someone would like to know what conservation looks like for this piece. You pointed out some of the cracking and other things about
Yeah.
the heat exposure. So
Yeah.
what are next steps for preserving the longevity of this work?
So because the cracks in the cerulean blue are so old and most of them are relatively stable, it did receive some what we call consolidation, that is readhering active cracks in the late 1990s. Most of the cracks remain relatively stable. So what I've done is to introduce a consolidant, an adhesive, into those cracks, working from the crack themselves on the paint surface. One of the things I can do is I can take a small hot air pencil and I can warm the surface where I've seen the infrared light come through. And if the paint is not adhered to the canvas below, as the paint warms to about 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 120, 130 degrees Fahrenheit, I can see the paint move. If it's well adhered to the canvas below, it won't move. But if it's floating above the canvas, it will slightly expand from being warmed. And then I know I need to put consolidant in that crack. So there was a period of about 12 weeks where I consolidated the cracks and stabilized them before I started cleaning the backside of that. So consolidation process with an adhesive that's engineered to be weaker than the remaining strength of the paint so that we don't overcome the remaining strength, so that if anything's going to fail, it's going to be my adhesive that fails and not more original O'Keeffe paint. That was the conservation process.
Well, thank goodness for people with the level of expertise you have who are able to keep these paintings
It's
safe.
incredible fun, I can tell you. It's great fun.
Wonderful. Well, in closing, I'll just share this one comment that I think just sums things up wonderfully. They say, "What a wonderful presentation. I love how you blended art, science, and history in your talk, and thank you very much." And I will second that. And thank you for all that you've shared today and for giving us such a wonderful perspective on this piece of work.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Okay, and thanks everybody for being here, and we hope to see you at the next one.